Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to discuss the physics of ego, and this will largely explain what an NPC is and why we seem to be experiencing an epidemic of stupidity throughout humanity in general. And please understand that I'm just winging this off the cuff. I don't have a script, I don't have any bullet points. I'm just going to discuss this as I've come to understand it. Now, I was thinking about the fact that life is electromagnetic and electromagnetism functions through the law of polarity. There is a projection and a recursion, the emanation and the reflection, and this is required for experience. Without reflection of the emanation, there could never be a witnessing of anything or an experience of anything. Like if you did not have a reflection back to yourself when you imagined something, you would never be able to even perceive your own imagination. And so, physical reality is a reflection of the emanation. And what this means is that time itself is like what we experience here in physical reality already existed. Physical reality and experience itself is the reflection. The emanation that produces the reflection already existed beyond what we call time. Because what we call time is just a recursive, fractal, linear experience of the frequency that was already in place. And so, in a sense, the present, what we call the present, is more akin to the past because it is just a reflection of what already existed. It's not something that is being generated moment to moment in the moment. It's a reflection of the frequency that was already in place. Now, human beings have two functioning choices. It's either yes to the full circuit of life, which is the emanation and the reflection, or no to the emanation, which will bind them into the reflection. This is the fundamental choice that was talked about in the Bible of eating from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. When they chose to eat of the tree, it severed their perception of the full circuit and caused them to identify with the reflection, which is the initial choice that produced the perception of separation, which is what produced the experience of fear. And, from fear comes greed and hate and all of the negative things that we experience. Now, what the ego is the personality structure that is the result of identifying with the reflection rather than the whole circuit, which includes the emanation. If you only identify with the reflection, you are going to be compartmentalized into only the recursive side of the law of polarity, which means you are never reaching the resolution point in the center so that it can be surrendered to the full emanation and then circulated again. Essentially, it's like looking in the mirror, but only identifying with the mirror and not even realizing that what you're looking at in the mirror is a reflection of you, not literally you. And so the ego thinks that it is literally what it is witnessing in the mirror, and that's why the ego is inverted, because it is identifying with the recursion, which is an inversion of the emanation. And it has to be because experience itself requires a reflection in order to be experienced at all. Without a reflection, you would never be able to perceive your own imagination, your own actions. There would be no perception of anything without a recursion of what was emanated. And so physical reality is a fractal recursion of the emanation of God's imagination. Now, an ego, since it only identifies with the recursion, which is the inversion of the emanation, everything that it perceives and acts and how it is going to be inverted. And this is why the ego, in order to validate itself, because it isn't surrendering to the full circuit of life, it has to, just like an electromagnetic circuit, because it is not reaching the point of resolution and receiving the full circuit, the full flow of coherence, because it's never reaching the point of resolution, it's still building pressure and it's still building, you could say, heat, just like an electromagnetic circuit. And so, what it has to do is disperse that heat out to the side and try to redistribute the heat, the pressure that it is experiencing, so that it doesn't accumulate enough entropy to just destroy itself. And so that is why ego constantly tries to experience validation. That's why it thrives on validation. And the fundamental structure that ego is functions the same fundamentally throughout all of humanity. And so ego itself will validate other egos because doing so is a form of self-validation. This is why, you have like celebrity culture, and this is why the ego has to shift blame, shift accountability. That's why the ego will look at another being and think that its own imagination defines the other being. This is why the ego projects. It is inverted, and so it's incapable of understanding that its own imagination is a self-definition of itself, rather than it literally thinks that separation is real. And so when it imagines something, it thinks that what it's imagining is separate from itself, which is logically just insane. But of course, the ego believes in separation, and which is logically insane. And so the ego has to redistribute this pressure and heat that it is constantly building from the friction of never reaching the resolution point. And so it will disperse the heat and the pressure out to the sides to other egos. And essentially this causes, over time especially, and multiple redistributions and multiple, dispersions of the heat and pressure, this is the attempt of the ego to maintain its ability to exist without destroying itself. Because if it gets too much pressure, too much heat, it's entropy. It will begin to destroy. This is why the consequences of sin is death. If you do not accept the emanation, if you say no to God, then you never reach the resolution point. And so the only choice left is death. And so the ego continuously redistributes its entropy, its incoherence to other egos in an attempt to survive. Because in a realm of separation, what you have to survive. Instead of being continuously filled with life, you have to fight to survive. And so the ego will constantly redistribute its entropy, and other egos will constantly redistribute their entropy. And this is essentially an electromagnetic circuit redistributing the heat that it is producing into other nearby circuits. And while this is happening, the other nearby circuits, as well as the circuit itself, are often also reproducing, producing children. And this is fundamentally also an opportunity to redistribute excess heat, entropy. And this is why the iniquities of the fathers are visited upon the children, because that entropy that these circuits are producing is then passed on to the children. And this is also why you see the most incoherent people often have the most kids. It's an attempt to survive. It's an attempt to redistribute that entropy, the building entropy. And so over time, though, this ends up causing this heat to redistribute and redistribute and redistribute until collectively the ego that is expressed throughout all of humanity becomes an expression of the lowest common denominator of that entropy throughout everyone. And this is why this is the concept of an NPC. They have redistributed and become like each other so much that they all lower down into this like averaged out frequency of separation. And that's why they all say slogans, thrive on narratives, avoid accountability, validate other egos. It's why they care about status and, you know, because it's all an attempt to inflate the self, because that's what the ego is. It's essentially self-idolatry. And that self-idolatry is the original choice in the garden to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil. It was to become like God, knowing good and evil, which essentially means to become the arbiter, to have free will, to be sovereign, and to decide what is good and evil in and of oneself. And naturally, that will only lead to death because existence itself is relational. You cannot be a sovereign being as an embodied, compartmentalized being. If you are not omnipresent, you cannot be sovereign because everything about your existence is dependent on the relationship between everything else, but fundamentally God and existence. Only God can be true because only God is omnipresent, only God is omniscient, only God is omnipotent, because only God is omnipresent. And so you can only be true in relationship to God. If you do not have a relationship with God, you cannot be true. And if you are true, you're not true in and of yourself. This is why the truth sets you free, not you decide what is true and so you are free. Because that you couldn't possibly decide what is true from such a limited, tiny, separate, individual, self-contained island. Like but that's how the ego thinks. It thinks that it is sovereign, and yet everything about its existence is interdependent on everything else's existence. The ego just cracks me up, cracks me up. And so, what an NPC is a homogenized reflection of separation that has been adopted over time and through all of the continuous redistribution of egos between themselves. And that's why so many people seem like NPCs, is because they are essentially the lowest common denominator of ego itself that has become so homogenized due to especially the internet. Because what is the internet? In a sense, it is like the most low resistance redistribution network of coherence and incoherence. And because of the way the ego just has to strive to be validated and to validate other egos as a form of self validation, this is why the internet is so full of incoherent garbage. Because the ego has to inflate itself by inflating ego itself through other egos. This is why you'll see, if you see in actual coherent, logical, helpful information that brings you closer to the truth, it'll have some views, some likes, sure. But then you see something that's just literal garbage. It's somebody just, you know, sitting down and crossing their arms. It's like 5 million views, 1,200 reshares, because this person's wearing an outfit. And the reason is because that is such a low effort, non threatening box. It's a way to redistribute the entropy and get a hit of validation for the ego. And that's all the ego does. It's constantly trying to redistribute its entropy in an effort to inflate itself so that it can avoid the pain of never reaching resolution. It's trying to survive in a dying circuit. And every little hit of validation it gets is the illusion of gaining life, because it's like the pressure and the entropy. It takes a little bit of that pressure off, a little bit of that entropy off, but it's momentary, because it's not actual growth. It's just a redistribution of the death. And so over time, though, what especially with the internet, as each new child is born, new circuits are coming in. And normally, the entropy of ego used to be slowly redistributed into the children, more slowly at least. And the children would at least be coherent enough to function somewhat properly by the time they reached adulthood. But with the internet, the entropy is filling these children faster than it has ever filled them, because the redistribution is a lower resistance network than it has ever been. So by the time children are reaching adult age, the heat is so redispersed through everybody that they're not even properly functioning at the times that previously they were still at least able to function. And so it's essentially causing the heat death of all of the dead circuits that have refused God. And that's why the world looks as it does. It's literally a refusal to acknowledge God and reach that point of resolution and surrender to Him. And I'm not even specifically religious when I talk about this stuff. I mean, God is 100% real, but and I use the Bible a lot because it is full of wisdom, but a lot of people don't see that in the way that I do, like through the electromagnetic lens and the law of polarity. But it explains why people are the way they are. And the interesting thing about it, too, is that it also explains the differences between men and women. And as an embodied being, we are a recursion, and so we're already inverted. And this is also why it says in the Bible that men, humans, people, are inherently wicked because we're inherently inverted. And unless we surrender to God, to coherence itself, then we will be inherently inverted because we're literally living in the reflection. That's why we're made in the image of God. And so, unless we surrender to the full circuit of life, which is surrendering to God, then we will perceive ourselves as these tiny, separate, separate and somehow sovereign, which doesn't even make sense, beings. And in that, we will be greedy. In that, we will be warlike because we will be afraid. But when you surrender to the full circuit and you see that God is omnipresent and He is continuously offering resolution and life, then the fear dissolves because you know that what is unfolding is not an accident. And if it's not an accident, then it was designed to be what it is. And if it was designed, then there's a designer. And if there is a designer, then there's intelligence behind the unfolding. But if we separate our perception from that by cutting ourselves off, we will be blind to the unfolding, to the intelligent unfolding that is happening. We will be blind to our ability to make sense of it. But when you stop identifying with the reflection and surrender to God and understand the full circuit of existence unfolding from His emanation, not just manifesting itself in the moment, then things start to make more sense.